Welcome, my dear friends, fellow lovers of literature, and seekers of deeper meaning in the world of cinema. Before we begin, I want to extend a warm, heartfelt thank you for being here with me. If you find joy in this kind of reflective exploration, if you enjoy peeling back the layers of movies the way one might carefully turn the fragile pages of an old book, then I would kindly ask you to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep this little corner of thoughtful film analysis alive, a place where we can sit together and talk not just about what a movie shows us, but about what it whispers to our hearts. And let me also be clear from the very start, what I'm about to share is not a conventional review. It is not a checklist of performances, direction, or technical merits. This is an intellectual, theoretical, and deeply personal reflection, crafted primarily for those of you who approach film the way one approaches literature, seeking insight, symbolism, and the echoes it leaves in our own lives. The film at the center of our conversation tonight is Rambo III, released in 1988. That is the only time I will name it. After this moment, it becomes something else. Not just a film, but a landscape of ideas, a canvas of questions, and a reflection of the world it was born into. And perhaps, if we allow ourselves to enter it with both imagination and vulnerability, it becomes a mirror of our own struggles, our own battles, our own attempts to make sense of violence, loyalty, and survival. I remember the first time I encountered this movie, though not in a theater. It came to me later, in a living room where the curtains were half drawn and the hum of an old VHS player filled the silence between scenes. I was too young, perhaps, to understand its political undertones, too inexperienced to catch the historical weight it carried. Yet even then, I felt something stir, a kind of tension between the unstoppable physicality of the protagonist and the quiet emptiness in his eyes. There was muscle, yes, and action and spectacle, but there was also something else, a man lost in the world, carrying burdens too heavy for words. That paradox, I think, is what makes this story more than just an action spectacle. It is a narrative that invites us to ask, what does it mean to fight? What does it mean to be alone, even in the midst of chaos? When we step back and look at the film as a whole, we see a fascinating intersection of art, propaganda, and personal myth-making. It was made at the tail end of the Cold War, when tensions between superpowers were reflected not only in diplomacy and weaponry, but in the very stories we told ourselves. Cinema in that era became a kind of battlefield of its own, where ideas of freedom, patriotism, and heroism clashed with cynicism, disillusionment, and the raw human cost of global conflict. In this particular narrative, the character at the center embodies both a weapon and a wound. He is both larger than life and painfully human, both a savior and a victim of the world that shaped him. The film takes us to landscapes that feel both foreign and strangely familiar. Vast deserts, crumbling ruins, and the sound of helicopters cutting through still skies. These are not just settings, they're metaphors. The desert becomes a symbol of isolation, of exile, of the stripping away of comforts until all that remains is endurance. The ruins are reminders of civilizations that once stood tall but fell to the endless cycle of war. And the helicopters, always hovering, always watching, remind us of the inescapable machinery of power, the kind of power that crushes individuals under the weight of ideology. And yet, at the heart of this story is not ideology itself, but relationships. There's a bond of loyalty, the kind that drives one man to cross boundaries and risk everything for a friend. That friendship, tender in its quietness, fierce in its devotion, is the soul of the story. It reminded me of the ways literature often frames companionship as a defiance against despair. Think of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, or Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, or even Frodo and Sam. These pairs are more than companions. They're lifelines. In this film, too, that bond becomes the only justification for violence, the only light in a world consumed by fire. The plot unfolds with a kind of relentless rhythm, drawing us deeper into the clash between one man and an empire. The action sequences are explosive, almost overwhelming, but they are punctuated by moments of silence, of contemplation. Those quiet pauses are where the meaning hides. A glance at the horizon, a hesitation before pulling the trigger, a hand resting on a wounded shoulder. It is in those spaces that we feel the weight of the journey. Not just the physical journey through hostile terrain, but the inward journey of a man who cannot escape himself. One of the aspects that struck me most, upon rewatching it years later, is the way the film oscillates between myth and reality. On one hand, it is mythic. Our hero becomes a near demigod, facing impossible odds with unyielding strength. On the other hand, it is painfully real, the mud, the blood, the unbearable suffering of those caught in the crossfire. This duality reflects something universal in literature, the tension between how we wish to see ourselves and the truth of what we are. We create myths of invincibility because reality is so fragile. We tell ourselves stories of ultimate victory because real wars often end in nothing but loss. And here is where the film resonates with me on a very personal level. I grew up in a world where conflict was not an abstract idea, but a shadow that hung over conversations, news reports, and even family gatherings. Though I was far from the front lines, I could feel the presence of war in the way people spoke of fear, of hope, of survival. Watching this film as an adult, I felt that echo return. It was not the gunfire that unsettled me, nor the explosions. It was the silence in between. It was the knowledge that behind every act of violence, there are real people, real families, real wounds that never heal. If I were to summarize the story in a way that carries both excitement and reverence, I would say this. It is the tale of a man who steps back into the fire after trying to escape it. He is called not by ideology or politics, but by love for a friend. Along the way, he confronts enemies both external and internal, armies of soldiers and armies of memories. There are daring rescues, battles that push the limits of human endurance, and choices that test the very essence of loyalty. There are betrayals and surprises, and moments when death seems certain, only to be defied by sheer will. And yet, even in victory, there is no peace. The triumphs are always shadowed by the knowledge of what was lost, of what cannot be undone. There are twists that I won't spoil outright, because I believe, even in analysis, some mysteries should remain intact. But I can tease this much. The story forces us to ask what one man can do against the machinery of an empire, and whether personal loyalty can stand as a meaningful act in the face of global cruelty. It asks us to consider the cost of freedom, not in abstract political slogans, but in blood, in silence, in scars carried long after the war ends. By the time the credits roll, we are left not with a sense of closure, but with a lingering unease. And perhaps that is the point. Stories of war should not leave us comfortable. They should leave us questioning. They should leave us restless, pondering the thin line between heroism and futility, between survival and despair. And that, my friends, is why I return to this film not as an action blockbuster, but as a piece of literature written in images and sound. It is a text that deserves to be read carefully, interpreted thoughtfully, and held up to the light of our own lives. For me, it remains a reminder that even the loudest explosions hide silences that are harder to bear, and that even the strongest warriors carry wounds no one else can see. So, as we close this reflection together, I invite you once more, share your thoughts, your interpretations, your personal connections to this story. And if you felt a spark of recognition in what I've shared, please like and subscribe so that we may continue these conversations about cinema, about literature, about life itself. Until next time, may the stories you encounter lead you not just to entertainment, but to deeper understanding, to reflection, and perhaps even to healing. My dear friends, welcome back to another long evening of storytelling, reflection, and that peculiar joy that comes from walking into a film not as a casual spectator, but as one who searches for meanings hidden between its images. I trust by now you know that this space is not for hurried judgments or rapid-fire opinions. This is a gathering of minds who love literature, who love depth, who love to treat movies as we would a novel read by lamplight. And so, as we step forward together, I invite you once more. If these explorations give you a sense of recognition, if you find a home in these words, please do like and subscribe. Not for me, but for the continuation of this shared space where cinema becomes text, where we explore the heart of stories with both reverence and intimacy. Now, let me take you into the unfolding of this particular narrative. Imagine with me. The curtain rises, not literally, of course, but in the way a story opens when the world of a character begins to reveal itself to us. We are not thrown into chaos immediately. No, instead we are allowed to linger in a moment of quiet disconnection. Our central figure has stepped away from the battles of the past, not because they are resolved, but because they have become unbearable. He has chosen solitude, as so many literary heroes do when the weight of the world proves too heavy. Think of Achilles sulking in his tent, or Siddhartha leaving his palace. In our film, the hero retreats to a monastery in Thailand. There is something profoundly symbolic about this setting. A monastery is a place of stillness, of renunciation, of silence. It is also a place of contradictions, because silence can soothe, but can also amplify the voices inside one's head. I remember the first time I saw this opening. I felt the heat of the sun on stone, the dust swirling in the air, the way his body seemed to belong here and not belong here at the same time. He is working with his hands, repairing, building, sweating in labor. Yet his face tells us this is not true peace. It is escape. And isn't that such a human thing? We run from our pain, hoping work, sweat, or distance will keep it from finding us. But like the old Greek tragedies remind us, destiny has a way of calling us back, no matter where we hide. And then the call arrives. It is not a mystical vision, not the whisper of gods, but the intrusion of old acquaintances. His former commander appears, a man who has been both mentor and father figure. He comes with news, with a request, with that weighty voice that tries to cloak obligation as destiny. The world is burning elsewhere. A war rages in the mountains of Afghanistan, where people struggle under oppression and violence. The commander is going, and he asks our reluctant hero to join. Here, the story gives us one of its most poignant moments. Our hero refuses, and not with anger or hostility, but with the quiet heaviness of a man who has fought too many battles, who knows what war takes from the soul. He says no. He chooses the monastery, the silence, the attempt at peace. And this moment resonated with me in a way I could not forget. Because how often do we see characters in action stories refuse the call? How often do they stand firm and say, I cannot, I will not, I must not return to the violence that broke me. It reminded me of Odysseus, who once pretended to be mad so he could avoid going to Troy. Heroes, too, are human. Heroes, too, grow weary. And yet, as literature reminds us again and again, the refusal of the call is never the end of the story. Fate moves forward regardless. The commander leaves, going on his mission into the Afghan mountains. And our protagonist stays behind, carving out his fragile routine of labor, silence, and sweat. But then the news comes. The mission has failed. The commander has been captured. He is imprisoned by the enemy, held in a fortress that looms like a medieval castle against the desert sky. I remember feeling the silence at that moment, because the film does not need to explain to us what will happen next. We know, somewhere in the heart of our protagonist, loyalty stirs. Friendship outweighs solitude. He cannot leave the one man who has always stood beside him. And so, with a slow inevitability, the journey begins. What follows is not just preparation for a rescue. It is a pilgrimage. Our hero travels into the heart of a conflict that was very much alive in the world at the time the film was made. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was not just backdrop. It was reality. And so, even as the movie spins its fictional tale, it is layered with the weight of history, with the suffering of real people who lived under those skies. For me, this part of the story always carried a strange heaviness, because I could feel the echo of newspaper headlines, of whispered conversations in households across the globe, of the way war in far-off lands bleeds into the consciousness of all humanity. Arriving at the Afghan border, our hero meets those who will become his temporary allies. The Mujahideen, villagers and fighters bound by their determination to resist oppression. These are not polished soldiers. They are farmers, shepherds, ordinary men transformed by necessity into warriors. The film introduces us to them not as faceless masses, but as individuals, children laughing, elders mourning, families living in the shadow of helicopters. And in those glimpses, the story does something profound. It humanizes the landscape of war. It tells us, this is not just a battlefield, it is a home. It reminded me of literature's gift for anchoring epic struggles in the ordinary. Homer sings of Achilles' wrath, but he also lingers on the weeping of mothers, the trembling of children. And here, too, the movie insists, remember the faces, remember the cost. Among these allies, one figure stands out, a leader of the resistance, a man of dignity and quiet strength. He welcomes our hero, not with blind trust, but with a kind of cautious recognition. They share food, they share silences, they share the mutual understanding of men who have both lost too much to name. Their bond, though fragile at first, grows through the journey. It is forged not in speeches, but in small acts. The exchange of respect, the willingness to listen, the recognition of pain in the other's eyes. And so begins the journey into the mountains. Imagine it with me. The harsh sun beating down, the clatter of hooves as horses carry them over rocky terrain, the constant awareness that danger could descend at any moment from the skies above. There's a raw beauty in these scenes, the vastness of the desert, the majesty of the peaks, the resilience of those who call this land home. I found myself lingering on those images, letting them breathe, because they remind me of how literature often uses setting not as backdrop, but as character. The mountains here are not passive. They are alive. They test endurance. They shape destiny. They hold both sanctuary and threat. The first clash with the enemy comes swiftly, almost inevitably. A Soviet patrol, helicopters thundering in the distance, gunfire echoing through the valley. And in that chaos, we see the stark contrast between the industrial machinery of empire and the raw determination of villagers defending their land. It is not an equal fight, yet in the heart of our protagonist burns a fury that tips the scales. His skills, honed through years of battle, become the unlikely shield for those who fight with little more than courage and faith. The battle is fierce, and though survival is won, it comes with loss. Always with loss. And this is where I feel the story gripping my heart most tightly. Because in literature, victory is never pure. It is always stained by what is sacrificed along the way. After this clash, the path grows darker. They move closer to the fortress, closer to the place where the commander is held. Along the way, there are moments of quiet reflection. Our hero sits with the villagers, listens to their stories, watches their children play in the dust. And in those moments, something softens in him. He is no longer the solitary man of the monastery, nor the reluctant warrior dragged back into violence. He becomes something else, a man who sees the universality of struggle, the shared humanity in faces far from his own homeland. It reminded me of how Tolstoy wrote of war in War and Peace, not just through the eyes of generals, but through peasants, lovers, children, ordinary souls whose lives are swallowed by the tides of history. There's also a sense of foreboding that creeps in, because the closer he comes to his friend's prison, the more impossible the task seems. The fortress is heavily guarded, the enemy merciless, the odds insurmountable. Yet this, too, is a hallmark of great storytelling. The hero must walk into the mouth of impossibility. He must step where no man could step, because that is the only way the story reveals who he truly is. And so, as this part of the story reaches its first turning point, we stand on the edge of something immense. We have seen solitude, refusal, the stirring of loyalty. We have walked across deserts and mountains, witnessed battles, felt the weight of humanity in the eyes of villagers, and sense the looming shadow of the fortress where a friend awaits. And yet, the rescue itself, the confrontation with destiny, that still lies ahead. I remember pausing, even when first watching, at this point in the story. Pausing not the tape, but in my heart, because I realized the film was not simply about action. It was about loyalty that refuses to die. It was about the way one man's personal devotion can become entangled with the struggles of an entire people. It was about the way solitude can be broken by the pull of friendship, the way silence can be shattered by the cry of injustice. And most of all, it was about that tension between the impossibility of a mission and the inevitability of attempting it anyway. And that, my friends, is where I will leave this unfolding for now. On the precipice, in that sacred space literature often creates, where we stand not at the conclusion, but at the moment before the storm. The journey so far has brought us here. A monastery, a refusal, a capture, an alliance, battles in the desert, and the shadow of a fortress looming ahead. What comes next, as we know, will test everything. But for now, let us linger in this space, this breath before the plunge, this silence before destiny reveals its full hand. My dear companions in thought, let us continue our wandering into this tale, for stories of this kind are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be lived step by step, as if we are walking across a vast desert ourselves, waiting to see what rises on the horizon. When last we left our journey, we stood on the threshold of a fortress, a place that felt less like stone and mortar and more like a manifestation of impossibility itself. Our hero and his unlikely allies had endured the harshness of landscape and the cruelty of war, and now the true test was at hand. The rescue of a friend who symbolized not just personal loyalty, but also the last thread binding our central figure to the world of human connection. The fortress itself becomes almost mythic when we first glimpse it. Its walls are high, its gates impenetrable, its guards relentless. It looms against the sky like some dark castle out of medieval legend, the kind that would appear in Dante's verses or in the nightmares of a wandering knight. To look at it is to feel futility settle like a stone in the chest. Yet literature has taught us again and again that when the world presents the immovable object, the human heart seeks to become the unstoppable force. Our protagonist approaches not with arrogance, but with that grim quietness that has followed him since the beginning. The plan to enter this place is both desperate and ingenious, and it unfolds with a kind of raw tension that grips the viewer. He slips into the shadows, using not brute strength but patience, cunning, and the uncanny ability to blend with darkness itself. Watching these sequences always made me think of Odysseus sneaking into Troy, not as a roaring warrior, but as a figure cloaked in guile and endurance. There is something almost poetic in the way silence, rather than explosions, dominates the early stages of this attempt. And then, of course, silence gives way to violence. Discovery is inevitable. The fortress, like all prisons, is designed not only to keep its captives in, but to crush the spirit of anyone who dares to enter. Alarms ring. Soldiers pour into the corridors. The night erupts with chaos. And in the midst of it, our hero fights with the ferocity of a man whose every wound has been turned into a weapon. I remember the first time I saw this eruption on screen. It was not simply exciting, it was terrifying. Because this is not clean, choreographed action. It is raw, bloody, desperate, and yet through it all runs the singular purpose, to find the captured commander and bring him out alive. And then, in the bowels of that fortress, amidst damp stone and the echoes of suffering, the reunion occurs. The commander is found, broken but unyielding, his spirit battered but not extinguished. There is something deeply moving in their brief exchange because words are few. It is not speeches or declarations that bind them. It is the unspoken recognition of loyalty that has crossed oceans and deserts. That, my friends, is where the story becomes not just about action, but about the poetry of human devotion. It reminded me of moments in literature where friendship becomes salvation. Horatio, standing by Hamlet, or Sam carrying Frodo when he can no longer walk. But of course, escaping is never as simple as finding the captive. Once discovered, the entire fortress becomes a labyrinth of fire and fury. What follows is a sequence of endurance. Walls blasted apart, bullets cutting the air, bodies falling in pursuit or defense. The fortress, which once seemed like a symbol of impenetrability, begins to crumble under the weight of sheer determination. And here, the story reaches one of its many peaks, not in the perfection of victory, but in the raw defiance of survival. They escape, yes, but not unscathed. The body is marked, the soul is heavier, and the war outside still rages. It would be easy for the story to end there, with the friend rescued, the impossible made possible. But this is not a tale of easy resolutions. The world beyond the fortress is still burning, and the enemy is relentless. Helicopters rise, armored vehicles thunder across the desert, and once again the small band of villagers and fighters find themselves face to face with the might of empire. I always pause in my heart at this stage, because this is where the film's narrative stretches beyond individual loyalty into something larger. The fight is no longer just for one man. It is for the dignity of an entire people, for the right to live free on their own soil. The battles that follow are not mere spectacles. They are layered with symbolism. Each clash between the villagers and the machinery of war becomes a clash between human resilience and industrial brutality. Each explosion is an echo of history, reminding us of how often ordinary people have had to fight against overwhelming odds. And in the center of it all stands our protagonist, not as a savior descending from on high, but as a man who has chosen, once more, to stand with others rather than alone. That choice, I think, is the true heart of the story. It tells us that even the most solitary of souls can be drawn back into humanity when loyalty and justice demand it. There are twists in this stretch of the journey, moments where betrayal seems near, where death appears certain, where the mission teeters on the edge of collapse. Ambushes in canyons, gunfire in the dust, the shattering thunder of rotor blades overhead. Each moment stretches the thread of survival thinner and thinner, and yet it never snaps. And this, too, resonates with the great traditions of literature. The hero must be brought to the brink of annihilation, not once, but repeatedly, for it is only at the very edge that the depths of the human spirit are revealed. And then comes the great climax, the massive battle that erupts with all the fury the film has been building toward. It is not confined to a fortress, not hidden in shadow. It sprawls across the open desert, where helicopters and tanks clash against horses and rifles, where the roar of modern weaponry collides with the cries of human defiance. The sheer imbalance of power is staggering, and yet that imbalance makes the defiance all the more profound. Watching it unfold, I could not help but think of ancient epics. The way the Spartans stood at Thermopylae, the way peasants rose against knights in forgotten revolts, the way oppressed people across history have chosen to resist even when logic dictated surrender. Our protagonist, in this final storm, becomes not just a fighter, but a symbol. His body, scarred and bloodied, becomes a testament to the will to endure. His actions are almost mythic, the kind of feats that would be sung by bards if this were an older age. Yet what keeps it from dissolving into mere fantasy is the weight of realism beneath it, the blood, the pain, the constant reminder that every victory is bought at a cost. And then, finally, the dust settles. The battle reaches its end, not with the tidy neatness of fairy tales, but with the exhaustion of survival. The enemy is pushed back, the villagers remain standing, and the commander is free. Yet victory does not come with triumphal music in the soul. Instead, there is silence again, that silence which has haunted our protagonist from the beginning. Because war, no matter how just, leaves nothing untouched. Lives have been lost, scars have been deepened, and though the sun rises again over the desert, it shines on a land still marked by suffering. The resolution of the story is one of quiet departure. There are no grand speeches, no proclamations of finality. Our protagonist, true to his nature, does not bask in glory or demand recognition. He has done what he set out to do, rescued a friend, stood by those who could not stand alone, and confronted once more the violence he had tried to escape. But he's not healed by it. He remains what he has always been, a man carrying more weight than one soul should bear, walking on into the horizon, searching, perhaps, for peace that may never come. And that, I think, is the brilliance of this ending. It refuses to give us comfort. It refuses to tie up every thread with a bow. Instead, it leaves us with a haunting awareness that some wounds never close, that some battles leave marks that outlast victory. And yet, at the same time, it leaves us with a glimmer of hope, the knowledge that loyalty still exists, that friendship can still call a man out of solitude, that resistance, however small, can matter in the face of overwhelming power. When I reflect on this final act, I feel as though I am reading not just an action tale, but a piece of tragic literature. It reminds me of the ending of the Iliad, when Achilles finally returns Hector's body to Priam, not as a resolution, but as a moment of fragile humanity in the midst of endless war. It reminds me of Camus' notion of the absurd hero, who persists not because he expects victory, but because resistance itself is meaningful. And it reminds me, too, of the countless unnamed stories in our own history, where individuals carried the impossible weight of survival, not for glory, but simply because they could not abandon those they loved. By the time the credits roll, I always find myself sitting in silence. And perhaps that is the most honest response, because stories like this do not ask for applause. They ask for reflection. They ask us to consider what it means to fight, what it means to stand by someone, what it means to live in a world where violence is so often justified and yet so rarely healing. They ask us, most of all, to carry the awareness that even in the darkest deserts, loyalty and courage can still bloom like stubborn wildflowers. And so, my friends, that is where this journey carries us. Through fortresses and deserts, through blood and silence, through loyalty and loss. It is a story that begins in solitude, passes through the fire of war, and ends with the quiet persistence of survival. A story that, like the greatest works of literature, refuses to leave us unchanged. The story we have just wandered through would lose its very heartbeat without the people who inhabit it. These figures, drawn in both shadow and fire, carry the burden of history, of friendship, of loyalty, of betrayal. To watch them is not simply to witness roles on a screen, but to encounter fragments of humanity we recognize in ourselves. Each one steps into the narrative like a character in a vast novel, shaped by forces larger than themselves, yet revealing truths that only individuals can. At the center stands the figure we cannot ignore, though I find it important not to treat him as a mere icon of cinema. To me, he is something far more complex, an archetype of the wounded hero, the reluctant warrior who tries to flee from destiny only to be dragged back into it. His silence says more than any speech could. He is sculpted from muscle and grit, yet what lingers is not his strength but his sorrow. When I think of him, I think of the countless literary wanderers who carry scars that cannot be seen. He is like Odysseus, longing for home but destined to wander. He is like Melville's Ahab, obsessed not with vengeance but with survival itself. And he is like Hemingway's Santiago, a man locked in a battle against forces larger than himself, measuring his worth not by victory but by endurance. What I find most haunting about him is his relationship with solitude. He begins in a monastery, seeking not glory but absence. Absence of violence, absence of noise, absence of memory. And yet solitude for him is not healing. It is merely an escape, fragile and temporary. Literature has always shown us that solitude can both heal and wound. Thoreau in a Walden Pond and found clarity. Dostoevsky's characters sink into isolation and find madness. Our protagonist belongs somewhere in between. His solitude is both necessary and unbearable. Watching him in those opening moments, I felt as though he were less a soldier than a monk of despair, trying to build a life from broken fragments. And yet, loyalty pierces his solitude. The figure of the commander, his friend and mentor, becomes the anchor to which he is bound. This commander is more than a man. He is the embodiment of paternal guidance, of unfinished obligations, of debts that cannot be repaid. Their relationship reminded me of Virgil guiding Dante through the Inferno. Not always gentle, sometimes harsh, but filled with an undercurrent of trust. When a commander is captured, it is not merely a military failure. It is a wound in the soul of our protagonist. He cannot remain in silence, knowing the man who once guided him is suffering. That loyalty, I think, is what transforms him from a mythic warrior into a human being. For what is more human than the refusal to abandon a friend? The commander himself is an intriguing figure. He is not flawless. No literary guide ever is. He is stubborn, proud, and sometimes blind to the cost of his choices. Yet he embodies a kind of dignity that is increasingly rare in the chaos of war. His capture is not just a plot device. It is a reminder that even leaders, even the seemingly invincible, can fall. And in that fall, they reveal their humanity. I remember watching his scenes of imprisonment and thinking of Prometheus bound to the rock, suffering endlessly yet refusing to yield. There is something mythic in the endurance of pain without surrender. Then there are the villagers, the Mujahideen fighters, the families whose faces flicker across the story like brief but powerful verses in a poem. They are not given the long speeches of heroes, yet they provide the narrative with its moral weight. Their presence reminds us that war is not an abstract struggle between nations, but a wound carved into the lives of ordinary people. I recall a moment when children played in the dust while helicopters roared overhead, and I thought of Tolstoy's insistence that war is not truly about generals, but about the countless unnamed souls crushed beneath their decisions. These villagers are the conscience of the film, reminding both the protagonist and us that violence is never confined to the battlefield. Among them stands a leader, a man who carries both dignity and weariness in his posture. He is not a mirror of our central figure, but a counterpart. Where the protagonist embodies solitude and silence, this man embodies community and endurance. Their relationship begins with suspicion, as so many cross-cultural encounters do, but slowly it ripens into respect. I always found this relationship deeply moving. It is as if two rivers, flowing from different mountains, converge in the same valley. They share little in language or upbringing, but everything in experience, loss, struggle, defiance. Together, they become a dual symbol, one representing the strength of an individual, the other representing the resilience of a people. Literature thrives on such pairings. Think of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, one dreamer, one realist. Think of Huck and Jim, bound by a shared journey across a river. Here, too, we see the miracle of unexpected companionship. The enemy figures, though often portrayed as faceless machinery of empire, are nonetheless important. Their cruelty is deliberate, their violence overwhelming, yet their very facelessness carries a meaning of its own. They are not individuals so much as they are embodiments of power systems that crush without mercy. Watching them, I thought of Orwell's descriptions of authoritarianism, or Kafka's depictions of bureaucracy that dehumanizes all who enter its shadow. They are terrifying not because they are monsters, but because they are ordinary men wielding extraordinary power without conscience. They remind us that evil in the real world often does not wear a villain's mask. It wears the uniform of the ordinary. And yet, I cannot help but notice that even within this faceless machinery, there are glimpses of humanity. A hesitation before a trigger is pulled, a fleeting look of doubt. These are subtle, almost invisible, but they matter, because they remind us of the unsettling truth. No enemy is purely evil, just as no hero is purely good. Literature thrives on shades of gray, and though the film tilts heavily toward mythic oppositions, these tiny cracks of humanity in the enemy remind us that war reduces everyone. Hero, villain, villager, commander, to roles they may not have chosen. What fascinates me most, however, is not just who these characters are, but what they represent when seen together. The protagonist, silent and solitary, embodies the wounded individual searching for meaning. The commander embodies loyalty and paternal guidance, the tether to a past that cannot be abandoned. The villagers embody the universality of human suffering, reminding us that war always falls hardest on those who never chose it. The enemy embodies the machinery of oppression, faceless and relentless. And between them all runs a single thread, the desperate attempt to find dignity in a world determined to strip it away. There is one more layer I cannot ignore, the symbolic function of friendship. Friendship here is not sentimental. It is not the kind of light-hearted camaraderie often depicted in adventure stories. It is sacred. It is heavy. It is the kind of friendship that makes a man cross deserts and walk into fortresses. And in that, it becomes literary in the truest sense. For in so many of the world's greatest texts, friendship stands as the last defense against despair. Think of Gilgamesh, undone by the death of Enkidu. Think of Achilles, driven to madness by the loss of Patroclus. Think of Hamlet, whispering to Horatio as he dies. Our protagonist's devotion to his friend is part of this same lineage. It is friendship not as comfort, but as burden. Friendship not as laughter, but as salvation. I must also pause to consider the way masculinity is depicted through these characters. It is easy to see only the physical, muscles, weapons, endurance. But beneath that surface lies something more fragile: vulnerability, grief, the inability to express sorrow except through violence. These men are not hollow idols of strength. They are broken figures hiding behind strength. To me, that is one of the most honest portrayals of masculinity I have seen in action cinema. Literature has long explored this paradox. Men who cannot cry turn to battle. Men who cannot articulate grief turn to silence. Our protagonist is the epitome of this paradox. And in him, we glimpse not only the cost of war, but also the cost of the story societies tell men about what it means to be strong. The commander, too, embodies this paradox. His pride is both his strength and his downfall. His dignity sustains him in captivity, but it also blinds him to vulnerability. The villagers, though often portrayed as tough and resilient, reveal moments of tenderness. The way a father looks at his child, the way laughter emerges in the midst of despair. These fleeting glimpses suggest that humanity, no matter how suppressed, cannot be extinguished even in the most brutal circumstances. What lingers most in my heart, though, is the way all these characters together form a mosaic of survival. Each one, in their own way, resists annihilation. The protagonist resists by enduring. The commander resists by refusing to surrender dignity. The villagers resist by living, by raising children in the shadow of death. Even the enemy resists, though tragically, by clinging to their power. In this way, the film becomes not just a narrative of individuals, but a meditation on the many faces of survival. And as I reflect on these characters, I find myself thinking of literature again. In Dostoevsky's novels, characters are often extremes, each embodying a particular philosophy or torment. In Homer, characters are archetypes, heroes, kings, gods, all exaggerated to reveal truths about humanity. In Tolstoy, they are painfully ordinary and thus painfully real. The characters of this story sit somewhere in between. They are archetypal enough to carry symbolism, but real enough to echo truths we recognize. And that, I think, is why they resonate so deeply. In the end, the protagonist walks away, as he always does, into silence. The commander survives, the villagers endure, the enemy fades into the background of history. But the characters do not end with the film. They linger. They follow us. They remind us that every war has its silent survivors, its loyal friends, its suffering villagers, its faceless oppressors. They remind us that beneath the explosions and spectacle lies the oldest story of all, the story of human beings, broken yet enduring, fragile yet unyielding, silent yet screaming for meaning. What continues to surprise me whenever I return to this film is how the story on screen and the story behind the camera seem to echo one another in uncanny ways. The film itself is a tale of endurance, impossibility, and survival against odds so overwhelming they border on myth. Yet the making of it, the quiet and not-so-quiet details that ripple beneath the surface, is filled with its own myths, accidents, coincidences, and strangeness. It feels, at times, as though fate was scripting two stories at once, the one we watched on screen and the one that unfolded in the deserts and editing rooms where the movie was born. One of the first unusual things that struck me, once I began to learn about the production, was where it was filmed. You would expect, perhaps, that a film set largely in Afghanistan would have been shot there, amid the harsh mountains and the raw landscapes where history itself was unfolding. But of course, reality is rarely so neat. The filmmakers chose instead to shoot in Israel and Thailand, using these places to stand in for Afghanistan. There is something strange, almost surreal, about that, watching scenes of Afghan villages and knowing they were filmed thousands of miles away. It reminds me of how literature often uses one place to symbolize another, layering meaning through substitution. In Heart of Darkness, the Congo becomes a symbol of the darkest corners of human nature. In this film, Israel becomes Afghanistan, and Thailand becomes the monastery's refuge. It is not just geography being disguised, but reality itself bent to the needs of storytelling. And yet, that choice came with its own oddities. Imagine the strangeness of filming a story about resistance against the Soviets while shooting in Israel, a country with its own complex web of geopolitical struggles. Soldiers, extras, and even equipment from the Israeli army were involved in the production, blurring the lines between fiction and reality. Tanks rolled across the desert for the camera, but they were also real machines of war, borrowed from a nation that lived in a constant state of readiness. That, to me, is one of the most haunting facts. The tools of war used in the film were not simply props. They were real instruments of destruction, repurposed for a story that itself blurred the boundary between myth and reality. There were also the helicopters. Those gunships that thunder across the desert skies in the film were not mere Hollywood models. They were authentic, provided by the Israeli military. And in some strange sense, that authenticity bleeds into the film. When you see them swoop down, hear the thunder of their rotors, and feel the desert sand whip against the camera, you are not simply watching fiction. You are seeing echoes of real training, real machinery, real battles that existed outside the story. It gives the scenes a weight that cannot be faked. And it leaves me pondering, how strange is it that a story about one war should be filmed with the instruments of another? Another odd fact is how close the story came to colliding with real-world politics. At the time of its release, the Afghan resistance fighters portrayed in the film were seen by many in the West as freedom fighters, symbols of resistance against Soviet occupation. The film dedicates itself to them, praising their courage. But history, unpredictable as always, shifted the narrative. Decades later, the same region and some of the same groups would be recast in very different lights, seen not as allies, but as adversaries in the global imagination. And so, the film became a kind of frozen artifact of a particular historical moment, one where the heroes of the story were aligned neatly with Western sympathies. Watching it now, knowing what came after, is almost surreal. It is like reading a novel that proclaims one empire eternal, only to know with hindsight that empire crumbled soon after. It is not simply a movie anymore. It is a time capsule of geopolitics in flux. But perhaps the strangest fact of all is how much danger clung to the production itself. This was not a film made in sterile studios, safe from harm. It was shot in deserts and remote places, under conditions that tested both cast and crew. There were accidents, injuries, near misses. At one point, during filming in Thailand, Explosives used for a sequence went off in ways that were larger than expected, creating real danger for those on set. I imagine the fear in that moment, the sudden realization that fiction had become perilously close to reality. It is a reminder that when we watch the spectacle of fire on screen, there are always real risks, real bodies standing nearby, hoping the blast remains under control. The lead actor himself endured physical strain that borders on unbelievable. Already known for pushing his body beyond ordinary limits, he once again threw himself into grueling training to embody the role. His physique in the film is legendary, but behind it lay months of punishing workouts, strict diets, and relentless preparation. He was not simply playing a soldier. He was sculpting himself into one. And yet, even that was not enough to avoid injury. During the filming of intense action scenes, he suffered wounds that required hospitalization. At one point, he was said to have broken ribs. And yet he continued. That persistence, though admirable, also feels unsettling. What drives a person to push so far beyond what the body can bear? It made me think of tragic literary heroes like Roland in the Song of Roland, fighting until his lungs burst, or Lear raging in the storm long after his body should have given out. There is something almost self-destructive about that commitment, as though the line between man and myth had been erased. One fact that always lingers with me is the enormous scale of the production. Hundreds of extras were used to populate battle scenes. Many of them were not professional actors, but ordinary people brought in to lend authenticity. Imagine being a farmer or a villager, suddenly dressed as a warrior, standing in the desert while helicopters swoop overhead and cameras roll. To me, this blurring of reality feels almost uncanny. For those extras, the film was not just entertainment. It was a strange detour into another life, a moment where their bodies became part of a story far larger than themselves. And I wonder, did they feel the weight of that story? Did they know they were part of something that would echo across decades? Even the animals had their share of strangeness. Horses were used extensively in the film, galloping across desert plains, carrying fighters into battle. But working with animals is never predictable. On more than one occasion, horses bolted unexpectedly, disrupting carefully planned shots and placing riders in danger. These moments remind us that no matter how tightly controlled a production may seem, nature always has its own script. The desert winds, the behavior of animals, the heat of the sun. These were all characters in the making of the film, as unpredictable and essential as the actors themselves. And then there are the quieter facts, the details that seem almost absurd when placed against the backdrop of explosions and war. For example, during downtime on set, cast and crew would sometimes relax by playing games or sharing meals in the same villages used as filming locations. Imagine that. One moment staging a battle against overwhelming odds, the next sitting down to laugh over food with the very same people who minutes earlier had been extras playing desperate refugees. That strange whiplash between fiction and reality fascinates me. It feels like Shakespeare's players, who one moment are kings and queens on stage, and the next are ordinary men and women sharing ale backstage. There was also the matter of editing. The original cut of the film was significantly longer, filled with scenes that explored more of the villagers' lives, more of the internal conflict of our protagonist, more of the endless landscape of suffering. But much of it was trimmed to sharpen the action. I find that fact endlessly strange. Somewhere, perhaps buried in archives, exists a longer version of the story, a version where silence lingers a little longer, where faces of villagers hold our gaze more firmly. It reminds me of manuscripts in literature, where early drafts reveal entire passages cut before publication. What we receive is never the whole. What we see is only one shape carved from a larger stone. Another curious fact is how the film was received. In some places, it was celebrated as a patriotic anthem, a defiant cry against tyranny. In others, it was condemned as propaganda, a shallow glorification of violence. And yet, beneath both praises and criticisms, the film carried its own strange irony. It was both of those things and neither. To watch it as pure entertainment, is to miss its darker undercurrents. To watch it as propaganda is to ignore its mythic and literary echoes. It resists categorization, and perhaps that is why it remains so haunting. Even the dedication at the end of the film carries a strangeness that only grows with time. It praises the courage of the Afghan fighters, calling them freedom warriors. At the time, those words resonated with the political climate. But decades later, they feel eerie, almost ghostly, knowing how the narrative of global politics shifted. That dedication, frozen in the credits, is a reminder of how stories are always bound to their moment in history, and how quickly those moments change. It is like reading an old political pamphlet that once stirred hearts, but now feels out of place in a changed world. And there is, too, the strangeness of its legacy. Despite critical attacks and mixed reviews, the film has endured, not as a flawless work of art, but as an artifact, a cultural echo, a piece of history. It appears in conversations not only about cinema, but about geopolitics, about the Cold War, about the strange ways fiction and reality intertwine. To me, that endurance itself is a strange fact. How many films of that era have faded into obscurity? And yet this one, scarred and battered like its protagonist, continues to walk on, still talked about, still remembered, still debated. When I think of all these behind-the-scenes details together, what strikes me most is how they mirror the themes of the story itself. Just as the protagonist walks into impossible danger, so too did the production court danger with its explosives, its locations, its reliance on real machines of war. Just as the villagers blur the line between ordinary life and desperate resistance, so too did the extras blur the line between acting and living. Just as the film refuses to give us a neat resolution, so too does its historical context leave us uneasy, knowing what came after. The strangeness of the facts is not incidental. It is woven into the very fabric of the story. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth. The making of this film was itself a kind of war, not with bullets, but with cameras, not with generals, but with directors and actors, not with nations, but with history. It was a battle to tell a story in a world already saturated with stories of war. And in that, it succeeded. Not perfectly, not neatly, but in the same way its protagonist survives, scarred, weary, unresolved, but unforgettable. What lingers longest in my mind about this film are not the explosions or the noise of gunfire, though those dominate its surface. What lingers are the silences that follow, the stillness after violence, the heavy breaths, the glances between figures who know what has been lost. When I think of its most significant events, I find myself less interested in their choreography than in their symbolic weight. Each one becomes, in memory, not just an action set piece, but a chapter in an allegory, a fragment of myth, a parable about endurance, loyalty, and the futility of war. The opening sequence, set far from the deserts where most of the story will unfold, remains for me one of the most striking. The monastery setting, with its heat and stillness, seems almost borrowed from the pages of Dostoevsky or Hermann Hesse. Our protagonist is not introduced in battle, but in retreat. This decision was, and still is, remarkable. Most action films of that era begin by reminding us of the hero's strength. Here, the story begins by showing us his absence of desire. He is a man who wants nothing of war, who chooses quiet labor and self-exile. And critically, this event reframes the entire narrative. The monastery is not just background, it is thesis. It tells us from the first moment, this is not a story about bloodlust. It is about a man who has already seen too much, who resists the call, who clings to silence until loyalty rips it from his hands. Critically, that refusal complicates the film's reception. Many dismissed it as simplistic propaganda, but the monastery sequence undermines that idea. What propagandistic hero refuses to fight? What idol of national pride hides in silence, sweating in solitude, unwilling to lift a weapon? This event reveals an ambivalence at the core of the story, a discomfort with violence even as the film barrels toward more of it. It sets up the paradox that will haunt every later scene. A man who must fight, but who does not want to. That paradox is, I think, what lends the film its unexpected resonance even decades later. The capture of the commander is another pivotal event, one whose symbolic importance cannot be overstated. On its surface is a simple plot device, the mentor figure in peril, the student compelled to rescue. Yet, viewed critically, it becomes a metaphor for the way loyalty binds us against our will. The protagonist does not rejoin the fight out of ideology or political conviction. He moves because one man, one friend, is suffering, and that single thread of loyalty becomes the rope by which he is pulled back into hell. For me, this is one of the most emotionally honest decisions the story makes. It does not pretend that men are driven to war by abstract values. It insists instead that the pull of friendship, of human connection, is stronger than any flag or slogan. In literature, this is an old theme. Hector fights for Troy not because of strategy, but because of family honor. Achilles returns to battle not because of duty, but because of Patroclus. Here, too, the event reminds us that the grand machinery of history often turns on the smallest and most intimate of loyalties. The first encounter with the villagers and resistance fighters deepens that theme. It would have been easy to portray them only as background, nameless allies for the hero's mission. Yet the film lingers, just enough, on their humanity. Children laughing, old men carrying grief, women staring silently at the horizon. These glimpses matter because they prevent the narrative from collapsing into a simple one man against the world fantasy. Instead, it becomes a tale of solidarity. The significant event here is not just meeting allies, it is seeing the war refracted through the lives of those who live beneath it every day. Critically, this event anchors the story in a broader human struggle. It resists total abstraction. The film becomes, if only for moments, an ethnography of suffering. And those glimpses, however brief, are what allow the later battles to feel like more than spectacle. They feel like defense of human dignity itself. The ambush in the desert, the first large clash between resistance fighters and Soviet forces, functions as the first test of this uneasy solidarity. From a purely cinematic angle, it is exciting, gunfire, explosions, the sudden thunder of helicopters. But critically, its meaning lies elsewhere. This event dramatizes the imbalance of power. Tanks, helicopters, industrial weaponry against farmers and shepherds. The battle is not just a fight, it is allegory. It tells us, without dialogue, that empire always arrives with machinery, while resistance survives with only courage. Watching it, I cannot help but think of biblical stories, the Philistines with their chariots, the Israelites with their stones, or of Tolstoy describing peasants with scythes standing against Napoleon's army. This event, when viewed through that critical lens, elevates the action to literature. It becomes not about who shoots straighter, but about how human beings confront power they cannot hope to equal. The infiltration of the fortress is, of course, one of the story's most significant and iconic events. On one level, it is classic suspense. The hero creeping through shadows, alarms looming, danger at every turn. But when I pause and consider it critically, what I see is not simply suspense, but pilgrimage. The fortress is the labyrinth of myth, the underworld of literature. To descend into it is to face death itself. The commander, chained and suffering, becomes less a man than a symbol of what loyalty demands. The protagonist's entrance becomes an act of ritual, a descent into Hades, a confrontation with despair. Critically, this event matters not for the fight it entails, but for the silence in its middle. The brief reunion between two men whose bond outweighs any ideology. Their few words, almost whispered, carry more weight than all the explosions that follow. They remind us that meaning lies not in victory, but in devotion. The escape that follows, violent and chaotic, represents the eruption of suppressed inevitability. For so long, the protagonist has tried to resist the pull of war. In this event, he is forced to unleash the very violence he has suppressed. It is both triumph and tragedy. Critics at the time accused the film of glorifying brutality. Yet to me, this sequence reads differently. It shows violence as unavoidable once loyalty forces the descent into the fortress. It is not glory, it is consequence. And by staging it with such overwhelming force, the film seems less to celebrate than to confess. Once you enter war, you cannot escape blood. This is a critical moment in understanding the film's moral stance. It is not simple celebration. It is lament. The climactic desert battle, horses and rifles against tanks and helicopters, is the event most audiences remember. On its surface, it is spectacle, the kind of oversized finale that action cinema thrives on. But from a critical perspective, it is perhaps the strangest moment of all. For here, myth and history collide. The imagery recalls the most ancient of epics: cavalry charges, dust rising, human cries against the thunder of machines. Yet at the same time, it reflects the Cold War's real geopolitical tensions, with Western audiences asked to side with Afghan fighters against Soviet invaders. The battle is both Homeric and political propaganda. That double nature is what makes it fascinating. It refuses to be only one thing. It is epic poetry translated into film, and it is also a historical artifact of the 1980s. Its impact and reception, therefore, have always been double-edged. To some it was stirring, to others disturbing. To me, it is both, because it forces us to recognize how cinema can never be detached from its political moment. Critically, what makes this final battle significant is not its victory, but its cost. The enemy is defeated, the commander rescued, the villagers survive. And yet, the protagonist walks away alone. The event's true meaning is not triumph, but exile. Once again, he ends not with celebration, but with solitude. This, for me, is the most resonant choice the story makes. It insists that war offers no true victory. The commander is free, but the protagonist remains imprisoned by memory. The villagers survive, but their land remains scarred. The event concludes not with glory, but with silence. And that silence is the film's most critical statement. Thematically, each of these events builds upon the last to craft a meditation on loyalty, futility, and survival. The monastery teaches us about refusal. The capture of the commander reveals the pull of friendship. The meeting with villagers humanizes war. The ambush allegorizes imbalance. The fortress descent symbolizes the underworld of loyalty. The desert battle dramatizes both epic defiance and propaganda. And the final silence insists on futility. Together, they form a chain of meaning, each link necessary to the next. What fascinates me most, as I look back critically, is how the film's reception has shifted with time because of these events. In its moment, it was seen largely as action spectacle, sometimes mocked, sometimes celebrated. But with distance, critics and audiences alike have begun to see the ambivalence hidden in its structure. That refusal at the monastery, that silence at the end, those brief glimpses of villagers' humanity. These moments complicate the easy reading of the film as mere glorification. Instead, they reveal a text caught between myth and reality, between propaganda and literature, between entertainment and lament. And that tension, unresolved, is what has allowed the film to endure. Emotionally, the resonance lies in the paradox of strength and vulnerability. Each event tests the protagonist's body, yes, but more importantly, it reveals his soul. He is strong enough to endure explosions, but not strong enough to escape memory. He is powerful enough to rescue a friend, but powerless to find peace. He is victorious in battle, but defeated in silence. This paradox resonates because it reflects a universal truth. We too are strong in some ways and powerless in others. We too fight battles that leave us scarred long after they are over. As I think through these critical perspectives, I cannot help but connect them to literature again. In Homer, the events of war are always double-edged, glorious and tragic at once. In Dostoevsky, every act of loyalty leads to suffering. In Camus, every victory is undercut by the absurdity of existence. This film, though wrapped in explosions and spectacle, participates in that same lineage. Its events are not mere entertainment. They are allegories for the human condition. And perhaps that is why, despite criticism, despite political shifts, despite the passage of decades, the film remains impactful. Not because of its dialogue, not because of its polish, but because of the strange, haunting way its events combine to tell us what literature has always told us. That war is both myth and nightmare. That loyalty is both salvation and curse. And that silence, in the end, is heavier than any explosion. When I look back on this film, I sometimes think the story that unfolded behind the camera is just as compelling as the one that unfolded in front of it. The narrative on screen was about survival, loyalty, and the clash between an individual and the machinery of empire. Yet the narrative of its creation was also about survival, also about loyalty, also about clashes, though of a very different kind. The deserts, the helicopters, the sweat, the danger, they were not only part of the fiction. They were part of the making itself. And what fascinates me most is how the production process seemed to echo, in uncanny ways, the themes of the story it was telling. One of the first insights that struck me when learning about the production was the sheer scale of it. This was not a small, quiet film shot in the safety of sound stages. It was a sprawling endeavor that took the crew to distant landscapes, under harsh suns, into deserts where dust became another character on set. The filmmakers chose to shoot much of it in Israel, with its rocky deserts standing in for Afghanistan, and in Thailand, where the monastery sequences were brought to life. That decision already feels like a story in itself. Imagine the strangeness of recreating one war-torn land in another land still scarred by its own conflicts. History has a way of bleeding across borders, and the very soil on which the cameras rolled carried its own stories of survival and struggle. The collaboration with the Israeli military was perhaps one of the most unusual aspects of the production. Tanks, helicopters, and even some personnel were provided for filming. These were not hollow shells built in studios. They were real machines of war, the same ones being prepared for use in real conflicts. The production crew suddenly found themselves not just staging war, but borrowing its actual instruments. I find that detail almost chilling. When you watch the helicopters sweep across the desert sky in the finished film, you're seeing not models or special effects, but authentic hardware. The realism is undeniable because it is real. And yet there is something unsettling about that realism. Art borrowing the weapons of reality, fiction colliding with geopolitics. From the perspective of the crew, working with such machines posed endless challenges. The desert sun reflected harshly off the metal, making filming difficult. The helicopters were deafening, drowning out dialogue and forcing reshoots. Dust storms would rise suddenly, grounding flights and halting filming for hours. There are stories of entire days lost to weather, of actors sitting idly in the heat while the desert itself dictated the schedule. The crew, like the characters they were filming, had to learn endurance. Even the simplest of tasks became trials in those conditions. Makeup melted under the sun. Costumes were soaked in sweat within minutes. Cameras had to be shielded constantly from dust clogging their delicate mechanics. I often think of the cinematographer during these shoots, the way he must have stared at the horizon, trying to capture beauty while battling chaos. To frame the vast desert so that it became more than backdrop, to make it into a living presence, required patience bordering on spiritual devotion. And then, of course, there were the stunts. The film is filled with sequences that push the limits of plausibility. Explosions, daring escapes, bodies flung against stone. Many of these were done practically, without the safety nets of digital effects that modern productions rely on. That meant fire was real, blasts were real, debris flew where it wished. The lead actor, determined as always to embody his character fully, performed many of these stunts himself. There are accounts of him suffering injuries, broken ribs, deep bruises, torn muscles, yet refusing to stop. That commitment, while admirable, also carries something of tragedy. To risk one's body for fiction, to bleed for art, is both noble and unsettling. It made me think of performers in Shakespeare's time who fought with real swords, or of medieval bards who risked exile or death for the stories they told. The line between art and sacrifice is always thinner than we think. One anecdote that lingers with me is about the use of explosives during filming. In one sequence, the explosions were reportedly larger than planned, sending shockwaves across the set and startling not only the actors but the crew itself. For a moment, fiction tipped dangerously into reality. That image of a crew ducking as fireballs rose higher than expected captures perfectly the strange tension of the production. They were telling a story about war, but in doing so, they found themselves brushing against war's real chaos. It reminds me of the old theatrical superstition that plays about violence invite violence into their staging. Perhaps films about war invite something similar. The unpredictability of fire, the uncontrollable force of chance. There were also the animals, those silent, unpredictable participants in the story. Horses galloped across the desert, carrying riders into staged battles. But horses, of course, do not always obey scripts. There are tales of riders thrown, of horses spooked by sudden blasts, of entire scenes derailed by the stubbornness of creatures who refuse to perform on command. These moments must have been frustrating in the moment, but from a distance, they add to the strangeness of the production. For what could be more fitting in a story about resisting control than animals themselves resisting the constraints of cinema? And then there was the matter of scale. Hundreds of extras were used to create the impression of vast battles. Many of them were not professional actors, but locals brought in for the shoot. Imagine, for a moment, being a villager suddenly dressed in costume, handed a rifle, and asked to charge across the desert as cameras rolled. For them, the film must have been both alien and familiar. Alien in its staging, but familiar in its echoes of real conflict. These extras became, in their own way, storytellers too, their bodies lending weight to the illusion of war. I sometimes wonder what they felt when they later watched the film. Did they recognize themselves in the dust of the background? Did they feel pride, or did it feel strange to see their land transformed into someone else's story? The editing process brought its own oddities. Early cuts of the film were significantly longer, with more scenes devoted to the villagers' lives and to the protagonist's inner struggle. Much of this was trimmed in pursuit of a sharper, more action-driven pace. And so, once again, what we see is only part of what was made. Somewhere in vaults and archives lie scenes that might have changed the tone, that might have given us more silence, more reflection. I often think of those lost reels as the shadows of a ghost film, a quieter, perhaps more haunting version of the story that remains hidden from us. This is a truth of cinema as of literature. Drafts always exist, but the public only receives one shape, carved from many possibilities. Another fascinating production insight lies in the film's timing. It was released during the final years of the Cold War, when global politics were shifting rapidly. The decision to dedicate the film to the Afghan resistance fighters made perfect sense in that moment. Yet history, as always, moved on. Within a decade, those same fighters were viewed through a completely different lens. The dedication, once patriotic, became strange, even eerie. And yet it remains, frozen in the credits, a reminder that films are always products of their historical moment, and that what feels timely in one decade may feel uncanny in another. Behind the camera, tensions existed as well. Large productions always breed disagreements between directors and producers, between vision and budget, between safety and spectacle. There are accounts of arguments over how much violence to show, how far to push the scale of battles, how to balance action with character. These debates shaped the film in ways we may never fully know. Every cut, every reshoot, every trimmed scene was a compromise between visions. To me, that too feels literary. Just as a novel passes through drafts and editors, a film passes through debates and compromises. What we see on screen is always the outcome of conflict, not just in the story, but in the making, There's a curious fun fact about the music as well. The score, thunderous and stirring, became one of the most memorable elements of the film. Yet, composing it required navigating the fine line between mythic grandeur and somber weight. Too triumphant, and it would have sounded like propaganda. Too mournful, and it would have drained the action of energy. The composer walked that line carefully, creating music that both thrilled and unsettled. I sometimes listen to that score apart from the film and feel as though I am hearing a symphony about loyalty and futility. That, I think, is the hidden power of film music. It can outlive the film itself, carrying its themes in pure sound. Even smaller anecdotes carry their own charm. There are stories of the cast and crew bonding during downtime, playing games, sharing meals, laughing together in the same dusty villages where they later staged tragedies. These little human details matter. They remind us that behind every story of war is a crew of ordinary people, sweating, laughing, stumbling, carrying cameras, adjusting lights, eating lunch under the sun. To me, those moments are just as important as the battles. They reveal the humanity behind the myth, the laughter behind the explosions. The film's reception created its own peculiar stories. In some countries, it was celebrated as a patriotic anthem. In others, it was mocked or condemned. Yet in both cases, it sparked conversation. Audiences debated not only its action, but its politics, its morality, its place in the world. That, to me, is one of the greatest testaments to the film's power. It refused to be ignored. Whether loved or hated, it demanded attention. And in doing so, it secured a kind of immortality. When I put all these production insights and fun facts together, what strikes me most is how much they mirror the story itself. Just as the protagonist endured impossible odds, so too did the crew endure the desert, the dust, the accidents. Just as the villagers lent weight to the story, so too did local extras lend authenticity to the production. Just as the final battle blurred myth and history, so too did the helicopters blur fiction and reality. The film and its making are reflections of one another, each haunted by danger, each scarred by history, each filled with moments of both laughter and tragedy. And perhaps that is why the film continues to fascinate me, not only as a piece of cinema, but as a piece of lived history. It is not just what we see on the screen, but what we know happened behind it. The sweat, the injuries, the arguments, the laughter, the accidents, these too are part of the story. To watch the film without knowing them is to see only half the picture. To watch it with them in mind is to see something richer, stranger, more human. And so, when I think of this film now, I do not think only of the protagonist walking into the desert at the end. I think also of the crew walking into the desert at dawn, cameras on their shoulders, wondering how to capture the dust and the sun. I think of extras laughing as they eat lunch, of horses bolting unexpectedly, of explosions rising too high, of music swelling in a symphony, of editors trimming reels late into the night. I think of all the invisible stories stitched into the visible one. And that, perhaps, is the greatest fun fact of all, the realization that every film is two films, the one we watch and the one that was lived. When I recall this film, what returns to me first is not dialogue or even action, but images. The silence of a monastery drenched in sunlight, the endless roll of desert hills, the ominous walls of a fortress standing black against the sky. These settings linger because they are not simply places where events occur. They are characters in their own right, shaping the story as much as any human figure. If one were to strip away the landscapes, the architecture, the way the camera embraces or resists them, the story itself would collapse. The first setting we encounter, the monastery in Thailand, carries a symbolic weight that exceeds its simplicity. White stone, golden light, the sound of tools striking against wood, the hush of monks moving quietly. It is more than a backdrop. It is an argument. It tells us that the central figure is attempting escape, not through indulgence, but through silence. He could have fled to the chaos of a city, lost himself in anonymity, drowned memory with distraction. But no, He retreats to a place where silence itself becomes a burden. Cinematically, this setting is bathed in warm tones, the camera lingering long enough to let us feel the stillness. The choice to frame him against the wide openness of this sanctuary makes his isolation visible. It reminded me of literature where place is inseparable from meaning. Dostoevsky's prison cells, Hardy's fields, Hesse's rivers. This monastery becomes not only a location, but a mirror of his soul. Empty, orderly, heavy with unspoken longing. Then the desert appears, and with it a transformation. The deserts used in the film, shot largely in Israel, are vast and merciless. Cinematography here makes deliberate use of wide shots, emphasizing the smallness of human figures against endless horizons. Men on horseback, convoys of tanks, villages crumbling into dust. They are dwarfed by the land itself. This choice is not incidental. It reminds us that war is not only between people, but against landscape. The desert itself becomes adversary, indifferent to human struggle, devouring armies as easily as individuals. The palette shifts. Where the monastery was bathed in golds and calm light, the desert is harsh, bleached, almost metallic. Every frame carries heat. Dust clings to the camera lens. Watching, I could almost taste grit on my tongue.